So tonight we have another Mishnah, another passage of Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers, those Talmudic teachings that we were really examining from an angle of Talmudic wisdom for life. And what turns out to be, and I couldn't have planned this better than it lands on its own, it turns out to be that the topics discussed in the chapter that's studied this week are actually very relevant, some of the current issues. I think that this passage can teach us the key to equality, what really allows us to see people and treat people as equals, what do we need to get to that point, and along the way we'll even touch upon defund the police or not. So let's try. So in this passage, and I'm going to bring it up here, we have an interesting, although seemingly somewhat obvious statement. Rabbi Chanina, deputy to the Kohanim, would say, "Pray for the integrity of the government, for were it not for its fear of its authority, a man would swallow his neighbor alive." So Rabbi Chanina, who is the second Kohen, deputy to the Kohanim, meaning that there's always the high priest, and Rabbi Chanina was not the Kohen Gadol, not the high priest, but the secondary to the high priest. His teaching, he would often say, was to pray for the government. And they're translating this as the integrity of the government, but actually literally meaning would be Bishloma shel malchut, for the peace, for the stability of the government. Why is that important? Because if people would not fear the government, man would swallow his neighbor alive. So that sounds like a rather obvious statement that if there was no authority, there would be anarchy. And if there was no government, then there was no body to oversee and, if necessary, prosecute those who misbehave, there would be a real mess. And therefore, we should uphold the government. That seems like an obvious statement. And in fact, the Torah says elsewhere, in the Torah itself, we have the mitzvah of establishing a court system as well as a police force. And this is in Deuteronomy, in the final book of the Torah. The Torah says, "You shall set up judges and law enforcement officials for yourself in all your cities that the Lord your God is giving you, for your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment." So you're going to set up judges and law enforcement officials, both parts of the system, those who will judge between people as well as judge for criminal offenses, and then as well as law enforcement officials to make sure that the law is actually upheld. As the commentaries explain, that if there's no law enforcement, the judge can't do anything. All the judge can do is make a statement, but will anybody comply? Law enforcement is there to make sure that people comply. So here's the seemingly underlying idea and seemingly obvious idea to what Rabbi Chanina is saying, that there must be some structure of government so that people don't swallow each other alive. Now, this is a mitzvah in the Torah, which would be a mitzvah for the Jewish people, as we see here, for yourself in all your cities, for all your tribes, directed at the Jewish people. But this is actually a universal mitzvah. And this leads us to an interesting teaching, an important teaching, which is both very important as well as not so known. And those are the universal mitzvahs that apply to all human beings and are really the cornerstone of civilization. We'll go through them and we'll see as we come across the courts of justice one. This is a quote from the Rambam, from Maimonides, and he writes as follows: 6 precepts were commanded to Adam. So Adam, the first human being, as we study in the Torah, was given 6 mitzvot, meaning 6 rules, which would apply for all humans for all time. There were prohibition against worship of false gods, pagan worship and pagan belief, which was actually the root of much of the negativity of the ancient world, as we had occasion to talk in a recent course. The prohibition against blasphemy. Respect for God in particular is critical for a stable society, The prohibition against murder needs no explanation. The prohibition against incest and adultery. The prohibition against theft. But not only these prohibitions, but the command to establish laws and courts of justice. So it's a mitzvah for all people, with no difference or distinction for their religion or background. It's a mitzvah for all people, all children of Adam, all human beings, to uphold these rules, as well as to make sure that there are laws and courts of justice to enforce and oversee compliance with these important rules. Rambam goes on to say, even though we have received all these commandments from Moses, so we know about this by oral tradition that Moses told us. And furthermore, they are concepts which intellect itself tends to accept. So we, in a sense, didn't even need to be told about it because they are logical. Nevertheless, it appears from the Torah's words that Adam was commanded concerning them. We could also see it within the Torah. We can read in the text and discover, although it's not explicit, but it can be found in the text, all these 6 mitzvot, all these 6 rules as they applied already from the time of Adam. However, there aren't only 6 rules. There's one more, and it's also important. What's that one more? The prohibition against eating flesh of a living animal was added for Noah. As Genesis states, nevertheless, you will not eat flesh with its life, which is its blood. Thus, there are 7 mitzvot. So Noah, who's also the father of all humankind, the father of all survivors of the flood, is given an additional mitzvah, and that is to avoid cruelty to animals and not to rip the flesh of a living being, although some forms of, shall we say, less than appetizing to our sensibilities. In some cultures, to this very day, people are eating all kinds of wildlife, and in some cases also eating them while they're still alive, tearing those limbs and beginning to cook or eat them. That would be forbidden by this law, because it causes additional pain to the animal. So that was a law given to Noah. It was not previously discussed for the simple reason that people were not eating meat that early in history. People began eating meat at the time of Noah, and God told Noah, well, if you're going to eat meat, treat those animals as they should be treated. Now, before we get too sidetracked with all of these 7 laws and their importance for all of mankind, what we wanted to reach is that one law established courts of justice, establishing a system of justice and a system of law as a mitzvah for all people in all time. Now, that's why we know that Rabbi Hanina's teaching, where he says, pray for the well-being of the government, make sure that the government is stable, because otherwise people would swallow each other alive, reflects back not only to the mitzvah that God gives the Jewish people, that the Jewish people should have a system of courts, but actually for all people and all mankind of all time should be enforcing the law. The problem with all of this, which all sounds good so far, is that it's too obvious and too simple. The Mishnah, this Talmudic passage, would not be telling us something that obvious that we can figure out on our own. Particularly in these teachings, in the Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers, we know that these are the ethical, moral, advanced teachings of the Talmud, beyond the minimum. We call this the teachings of Hasidism, to really the Chasidusa, a way to serve God and a way to be a better person beyond the minimum basic requirement. A lot of the teachings we're reading is about bettering our character, refining ourselves, aspiring to a higher and greater standard. All of a sudden we have this teaching, which is really minimum for society. Don't swallow each other alive, have some kind of stability, law enforcement, court system to make sure that people live by a basic system of law. I mean, that's really obvious and really fundamental. It doesn't seem like the higher standard type of material and type of ideas that we've been discussing in this tractate. Well, that's why we have to go back and look at these words where Rabbi Hanina says that we should pray for the well-being of the government, pray for the integrity of the government. In the Hebrew, we call this malchut, the kingship. Now, the basic understanding here is that means the government. But there's another understanding, a deeper meaning here that harkens to the higher standard of what we may be discussing, and that is that the kingship that we pray for, that we remember, that we find so important, is the kingship of God. Focus on, remember, pray for the integrity of, in other words, pray for the recognition and the appreciation of the kingship of God. That the true way that a man should not swallow his fellow man alive is not from fear of the courts or fear of the police, but the man will not swallow his fellow alive out of fear of God, fear of heaven. And this is a very important, critical idea, because we know that in early human history, people did not respect each other, and there was not equality. And those who had the might had the right. Those who had the gold ruled, what some people call the golden rule. Those who were powerful found it normal and even their own version of moral and correct to oppress those who were weak. We know this from all ancient civilizations. We know the way they treated minorities, we know the way they treated foreigners, we know the way they treated women, we know the way they treated those they conquered, their slaves, etc., etc. There was no concept of equality or fairness. They believed that those who were more powerful had the right to dominate those who were weaker. This only changes when we bring in the understanding, as the Torah did early on in history, that man was created in the image of God. When this message starts to get out, people start to understand, initially the Jewish people and spreading to others, that man is created in the image of God. Every human is in the image of God. Even those who are weaker, even those who are less fortunate, even those who are foreigners, even those who are less able, or etc., they're also in the image of God, and they also have the right to peace, to safety, to stability, to whatever privileges are accorded to all humans belong to them as well. They also deserve to be respected. They are also equal people in the image of God. So the first step for a society to not swallow each other alive, to not come and say, whoever's the bigger fish will swallow the smaller fish, is the mora'ah shel malchut, fear of the government, not fear of the literal government and the police knocking on the door, but fear of God, recognition of God, and appreciating that every human being is created in the image of God. When we have that, we understand that every human being is deserving of respect and every human being is deserving of their space and their rights and their opportunities. And that's actually something that police can never replace. Force and the fear of prison or the court system can never replace an internal moral compass and an internal appreciation that God created us all, and God created us all equally, and we should be respecting each other. So this is a teaching that the Torah brought into the human consciousness, and today it seems obvious to so many of us, but way back then, people just did not live that way. So this gives us a greater and deeper understanding of our mission, of our passage, that we're talking about fear of heaven as the solution to the problem of people swallowing each other alive. But that too is not a, shall we call it, an advanced teaching. It's not a Hasidism teaching. This is not a teaching that's beyond the letter of the law. This is a teaching which is the Torah brought to the world and may have been new for some, but within the Torah's outlook, it's actually the minimum respect we give to a fellow human being, the minimum appreciation for our creation by God and what that means. And therefore, we're going to have to look back at this Mishnah and read it yet deeper and see yet a deeper type of teaching and a deeper meaning in all of this. Rabbi Hanina, the deputy of the Kohanim, would say Pray for the integrity of the government for. Oh, I'm sorry, I got to bring that up here. Pray for the integrity of the government, for were it not for the fear of its authority, a man would swallow his neighbor alive. Just having a little trouble bringing this up. Froze a little bit. So, let's try that one more time. Here we go. So Rabbi Hanina had said that were it not for the fear of the government, man would swallow his neighbor alive. We've been talking about this. Well, what does that mean, man would swallow his neighbor alive? In the simple sense, in the basic sense, we've been saying there would be anarchy. Whoever's more powerful would stomp on and overwhelm, swallow up the weaker one. But let's look at that in a more meaningful way. Man would swallow his neighbor alive can mean something very, very profound. If you ever lit a candle at noon outdoors, that candle is insignificant. The sun shines and nobody needs that candle. That candle is overwhelmed, swallowed up by the sun, by an overwhelming, much greater light. And sometimes we may feel that we are so good at or invested in and so talented at whatever it is we may be doing that when the other one shows up, when someone else comes into the picture and also attempts to do the same thing, we swallow them alive. We don't leave them space. We overwhelm their contribution, feeling that their contribution is not meaningful in front of ours. We don't touch them, we don't hurt them, but our perspective may be like that of the sun versus the candle at noon, the sun not needing or having any benefit from that candle, and actually that candle being swallowed up and insignificant in front of the sun. When we see this other individual who showed up, new kid on the block, who also wants to contribute, we may feel that their contribution is insignificant and only I make all the difference. We may be overwhelming them, swallowing them alive. The same thing can happen in the reverse. We may be faced with a situation where we are trying to contribute, to do something positive, to do something good. And when we come onto the scene, we find others greater, more experienced, more powerful, whatever it is, who seem to overwhelm whatever we might be contributing. We feel that we're being swallowed alive. We don't have anything to contribute to make a difference, to be meaningful here. We aren't significant in front of all these others or in front of that whole universe of everything that's out there. And here's where the Mishnah says that the fear of the government, again, meaning the fear of the kingship of God, is the solution for this. When we remember and recognize our creation by God and the presence of God, God created every human not only with equality on their own rights, but God created every human with a unique contribution. So I might be so good at X, Y, or Z, but that doesn't mean that I should swallow and figuratively overwhelm the other individual who also wants to make a difference. And I might be less good at something that I'm trying to do and feel insignificant in front of someone who does this so well or is just takes up all the space. But I should remember that God created me too. And that means that there's also something for me to contribute. So the solution, both to that we should avoid overwhelming and kind of perhaps without noticing it, swallowing the other by taking up all that space and not appreciating their contribution. The solution to that is the recognition that God gave them a role and God gave them significance and gave that to each human being. There's some difference they can make. And we should also remember that for when we're faced with a situation where we may feel that we have nothing to contribute. That cannot be, because God created us to make a difference. He didn't make any extras. He didn't make anything for naught. Each one of us can do something that nobody else can. So we have come to an understanding of this Mishnah, of this passage, both in a simple sense, reading some of the biblical background, and in a deeper sense of what that means for not swallowing others alive because of our fear of God, and not swallowing others figuratively, not overwhelming their presence because of our recognition of the gifts that God has given everyone. This would all seem to suggest that we should not defund the police. And it's necessary to have that fear of government to make sure that people do the right thing, although we call upon ourselves and we try to teach and inculcate that this should be done because of a fear of heaven and a deeper appreciation. But I do want to share another biblical text, which is very interesting in the face of all the current discussion about the police and law enforcement. And that is, way at the end here, where the prophet Yeshaya, Isaiah says, "And I will restore your judges as at first, and your counselors as in the beginning. Afterwards you shall be called City of Righteousness, Faithful City." So the prophet is promising that a day will come, this is the time of the Mashiach, when judges will be restored. The Jewish people, and we can apply that to others as well, will have that kind of leadership that we long for, with integrity, with moral honesty. The true judges that we used to have as at first will be restored, and our counselors that we used to have will be back in the play. Things will be the way they should be. And that's beautiful. But what's interesting here is that we talk about the judges, but we don't talk about the law enforcement. Here we had said the Torah commands us to set up judges as well as law enforcement, because what can the judge do without a system to enforce the law? Here, as we talk of the time of the Mashiach, we kind of forgot about the police. We said, restore your judges. We never mentioned the police. And that's because we're talking about a greater time, a better time, a time that we hope and aspire to, where we will not need that, where humans will do what's right, kind of along the lines that we've been speaking, out of fear of heaven, out of fear of the kingship of God, as opposed to out of fear of law enforcement. At that time, it won't be necessary, in fact, to truly have a law enforcement system like we have that today, because the judges telling us what's right, the leadership teaching will be enough. We'll have the inner conviction to do what's right, even without somebody frightening us or forcing us to do so. So I don't know if that's what people mean out there today when all this talk about the police, but I do know in the Torah's teachings that we need law enforcement now, because not everybody's perfect yet, but we're working on reaching a day, a messianic era, when everybody appreciates the presence of God and lives that higher, greater life without need to force them to do so. So this concludes our discussion of the key to equality, which we now understand is the recognition of God's presence and the fact that every human is created in the image of God. And next week on Monday, we will continue with yet another great class. Hope to see you all there. Same Zoom channel, same Facebook page, and